In a world where conformity reigned supreme, Zephyr was an anomaly, a brilliant inventor whose ideas were as revolutionary as they were unwelcome. His people, content with the status quo, saw his creations as disruptions to their carefully cultivated equilibrium. Zephyr's every triumph was met with scorn and dismissal, his genius reduced to a mere footnote in the annals of a society that prized stability over innovation. But Zephyr was not one to be deterred by the short-sightedness of others. He poured himself into his work, finding solace in the whirring gears and humming circuits of his machines. They were his companions, his confidants, the only ones who truly understood the depth of his passion and the scope of his vision. As the years passed, Zephyr's isolation grew, and with it, his determination to break free from the shackles of his world. He knew that somewhere beyond the confines of his planet, there existed a place where his ideas could flourish, where his creations could reach their full potential. And so, with a heavy heart and an unwavering resolve, Zephyr began to plan his escape. He retrofitted an old lunar trader's ship, pouring every ounce of his knowledge and skill into the vessel that would carry him to his destiny. The day of his departure was a blur, a frenzied rush of final preparations, and hasty goodbyes to the few who had stood by him through the years. As he strapped himself into the cockpit, Zephyr felt a thrill of anticipation coursing through his veins. With a roar of the engines and a blinding flash of light, he left behind the only world he had ever known, setting forth on a journey that would change the course of his life and the fate of a distant planet forever. Zephyr's ship hurtled through the cosmos, propelled by the force of his invention, a machine that defied the very laws of physics. Time seemed to blur as he traversed the vast expanse of space, his mind consumed by visions of the future he would forge. When at last his ship touched down on an alien world, Zephyr thought for a moment that he had come full circle, that he had somehow found his way back to the planet of his birth. But as he stepped out onto the surface, he realized that this was a place unlike any he had ever seen. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a vibrant shade of blue that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. The land stretched out before him, a tapestry of lush forests and rolling hills, each one bursting with a riot of color and life. But it was what lay beneath the surface that truly captured Zephyr's imagination. The planet was a treasure trove of resources, its very soil infused with the building blocks of industry: coal, copper, iron, oil. The elements that had fueled the rise of civilizations on Earth were here in abundance, waiting to be harnessed by a mind as brilliant and driven as Zephyr's. With a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long, Zephyr set to work, his machines humming to life as he began to shape this virgin land into a reflection of his own vision. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, that he would face obstacles beyond anything he had ever encountered. But in that moment, standing on the precipice of a new beginning, Zephyr felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This was his destiny, his chance to create something truly extraordinary, and nothing, not even the forces of an alien world, would stand in his way. The rise of a fortress. With an unwavering determination, Zephyr threw himself into his work, his mind consumed by the endless possibilities that lay before him. Day and night, he toiled, his machines working in perfect harmony as he built the foundations of his new life. At the heart of his efforts was the factory, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and whirring gears that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Zephyr had designed it to be a marvel of automation, a testament to the power of his intellect and the limitless potential of his creations. As the weeks turned into months, the factory grew, its walls rising ever higher, its machinery becoming ever more complex. Zephyr worked tirelessly, driven by a sense of purpose that bordered on obsession. He knew that this was his chance to prove himself, to show the world that he was more than just a forgotten genius, a cast-off from a society that had never truly understood him. But even as he reveled in the fruits of his labor, Zephyr failed to notice the growing unrest that stirred beyond the walls of his compound. For the natives of this planet, the arrival of the strange visitor, and his even stranger creations had been a source of great concern. They watched from the shadows as Zephyr's factory expanded, its smoke-belching chimneys and clanking gears a jarring contrast to the pristine beauty of their world. They whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with fear and anger, as they debated what to do about this interloper who seemed intent on reshaping their very way of life. It was only a matter of time before the tensions boiled over. On a clear, moonless night, the natives struck, their warriors descending upon Zephyr's factory in a wave of fury and flame. They tore through the compound, their weapons smashing through metal and machinery with a savage intensity. Zephyr, caught off guard by the suddenness of the attack, could only watch in horror as his creations were destroyed, his dreams reduced to smoldering ruins. But even in that moment of despair, he felt a flicker of determination spark to life within him. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the natives would not rest until he was gone, his presence erased from their world like a blemish on their pristine landscape. But Zephyr was not one to back down from a challenge. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let his vision be snuffed out by the ignorance and fear of others. As the smoke cleared and the natives retreated back into the shadows, Zephyr set to work once more, his resolve hardened by the fires of adversity. He would rebuild what had been destroyed, and he would make it stronger, better, more resilient than ever before. For he knew that this was not just a battle for his own survival, but for the very future of innovation itself. And he would not rest until this fortress stood tall and unassailable, a shining beacon of progress in a world that had yet to understand the true power of the human spirit. In the aftermath of the initial attack, Zephyr worked with a feverish intensity, his mind consumed by thoughts of defense and retribution. He fortified the walls of his factory, reinforcing them with layers of steel and concrete until they stood like an impenetrable barrier against the outside world. But even as he strengthened his defenses, Zephyr knew that he could not rely on walls alone to keep the natives at bay. He turned his attention to his machines, modifying them, enhancing them, transforming them into instruments of war. Automated turrets sprouted from the factory's ramparts, their barrels trained on the surrounding landscape, ready to unleash a hail of bullets at the first sign of movement. Drones hummed through the air, their sensors scanning the horizon for any hint of danger, ready to alert Zephyr at a moment's notice. And yet, despite all his preparations, the natives continued to come. They attacked in waves, their numbers seemingly endless, their determination unwavering. They hurled themselves against the walls of Zephyr's fortress, their weapons bouncing harmlessly off the reinforced steel, their battle cries echoing through the air like a chorus of rage and defiance. Zephyr watched from the control room, his eyes glued to the screens that monitored every inch of his domain. He saw the natives fall, their bodies littering the ground like so much detritus, but still they kept coming, driven by a fury that seemed to know no bounds. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Zephyr began to feel the toll of the constant siege. His body grew gaunt, his eyes sunken and haunted, his mind frayed by the unrelenting stress of survival. But even as he struggled to keep himself together, Zephyr never lost sight of his goal. He knew that he had to hold on, to weather this storm, to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than just a man. He was an idea, a force of nature, an unstoppable machine. And so he pushed himself harder, working tirelessly to improve his defenses, to find new ways to keep the natives at bay. He delved deeper into their society, studying their ways, their customs, their very essence, searching for any weakness he could exploit. What he found was a culture steeped in tradition, a people who revered the land and the creatures that inhabited it. They saw Zephyr as an invader, a desecrator, a blight upon their sacred home. And they would stop at nothing to see him gone, to restore the balance that he had so carelessly upset. Zephyr knew then that this was not just a battle for survival, but a war for the very soul of this planet. And he steeled himself for the long fight ahead, knowing that he would have to be stronger, smarter, more ruthless than ever before if he hoped to emerge victorious. For in this strange and savage land, there could be no half measures, no room for weakness or doubt. There was only the unrelenting march of progress, the unyielding will of a man who refused to be broken, and the machines that would carry him to his destiny, no matter the cost. As the war raged on, Zephyr found himself pushed to the brink, his mind and body stretched to their limits by the constant onslaught of the natives. But even in his darkest moments, he refused to give in to despair, knowing that surrender was not an option. Instead, he channeled his energy into his work, pouring every ounce of his genius into the creation of new and ever more powerful weapons. He developed guns that could track their targets with uncanny precision, missiles that could level entire villages with a single blast, and bombs that could turn the very earth to ash and rubble. But it wasn't just his weapons that evolved during this time. Zephyr himself was changing, his once idealistic vision of progress giving way to a grim determination to survive at any cost. He became a machine, his every waking moment consumed by thoughts of strategy and defense, his every dream haunted by visions of the natives and their relentless assault. As his fortress grew, so too did his army. Zephyr's machines became more than just tools. They became his soldiers, his companions, his very lifeblood. He imbued them with a rudimentary intelligence, programming them to fight with a ferocity and a loyalty that no human warrior could match. Together, they expanded the boundaries of the fortress, pushing back against the natives, carving out a foothold in this hostile land. But even as they made progress, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line, that he was becoming something other than human. He had always believed that his machines were a force for good, that they would help to usher in a new era of prosperity and enlightenment. But now, as he watched them mow down the natives with ruthless efficiency, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. Was this really progress, or was it something else entirely? Was he a savior, or was he a monster, a man so consumed by his own vision that he had lost sight of his own humanity? These were the questions that plagued Zephyr as he stood at the helm of his fortress, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind whirring with the calculations of war. He knew that he had come too far to turn back now, that he had to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. But even as he steeled himself for the battles to come, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a gnawing doubt that threatened to undermine everything he had worked so hard to achieve. For in this moment of triumph, Zephyr realized that he was no longer just fighting for his own survival, but for the very soul of his creation. And he knew that the choices he made in the days ahead would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of this entire world, and perhaps even the fate of humanity itself. As the battles raged on, Zephyr began to realize the true scale of the conflict he had unleashed. The natives, for all their primitive weapons and tactics, seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of warriors, each one more determined than the last to see Zephyr and his machines wiped from the face of their world. Wave after wave of attackers threw themselves against the walls of the fortress, their bodies piling up in grotesque mounds that stretched as far as the eye could see. And yet, no matter how many fell, there were always more to take their place, their eyes blazing with a hatred that seemed to burn brighter with each passing day. Zephyr's machines, for their part, held the line with a grim efficiency, their guns and bombs and blades cutting through the natives like a scythe through wheat. But even they could not stem the tide forever, and Zephyr knew that it was only a matter of time before the fortress was breached, before his empire of steel and circuit boards came crashing down around him. As he stood atop the ramparts, surveying the carnage that stretched out before him, Zephyr felt a sense of profound unease wash over him. He had always believed that his machines were the key to a better future, that they would help to create a world of endless plenty and boundless opportunity. But now, as he looked out over the scorched earth and the piles of corpses, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. What if his machines were not a force for good, but a force for destruction, a cancer that would consume this world and everything in it? The thought gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve, his confidence, his very sanity. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain of his own genius, his own unassailable rightness. But now, confronted with the reality of the war he had unleashed, he felt doubt creeping in, insidious and corrosive. And yet, even as his faith in himself wavered, Zephyr knew that he could not turn back now. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to simply lay down his arms and surrender to the natives. He had to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. And so he threw himself back into the fray, his mind whirring with new plans and new strategies, his machines churning out ever more deadly weapons and ever more sophisticated defenses. He would not let the natives win, he told himself. He would not let them destroy everything he had built. But even as he fought on, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle, that he was trapped in a war that could never truly be won. For every native he killed, two more seemed to spring up in their place, their hatred and their determination only growing stronger with each passing day. And as the bodies piled ever higher, and the smoke from the battles blotted out the very sun, Zephyr began to wonder if there was any way out of this hell he had created, any path that did not lead to his own destruction, and the destruction of everything he held dear. As the war dragged on, Zephyr found himself pushed to the brink of exhaustion, his body and mind ravaged by the constant stress and strain of battle. He had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to push through any obstacle, to overcome any challenge. But now, faced with an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, he began to feel the first stirrings of despair. He had lost track of how long he had been fighting, how many days and nights he had spent hunched over his machines, tweaking and tinkering and perfecting his weapons of war. He had forgotten what it felt like to sleep, to eat, to breathe without the constant taste of ash and blood in his mouth. And yet, even as his body withered and his mind frayed, Zephyr refused to give up. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let the natives win now. He had to keep fighting, no matter the cost. But as he looked out over the blasted landscape of the battlefield, he couldn't help but wonder what that cost would ultimately be. He had already lost so much, his home, his people, his very humanity. And now, as he surveyed the devastation he had wrought, he began to realize that he might lose even more before this war was over. For the planet itself was changing, warping and twisting under the onslaught of Zephyr's machines. The once pristine forests were now charred and lifeless, the rivers and streams choked with ash and debris. The very air was thick with the stench of death and decay, a miasma that seemed to seep into every pore and crevice of Zephyr's being. And yet, even as he recoiled from the horror of what he had done, Zephyr knew that he could not stop now. He had to see this through to the end, to find a way to break the cycle of violence and destruction that he had unleashed upon this world. But what would that end look like? Would he emerge victorious, his machines triumphant over the natives and their primitive ways? Or would he be consumed by the very forces he had sought to control, his empire of steel and circuit boards crumbling to dust beneath the weight of his own hubris? These were the questions that haunted Zephyr as he stood atop his fortress, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the natives and their next attack. He knew that he had to find a way to end this war, to find a path to peace and coexistence with the beings he had once sought to conquer. But even as he pondered these weighty matters, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The natives were growing bolder, their attacks more frequent and more devastating, and his own resources were dwindling, his machines beginning to break down under the constant strain of battle. He knew that he had to act fast, to find a way to turn the tide of this war before it was too late. But as he looked out over the blasted landscape of his own making, he couldn't help but wonder if he had already gone too far, if there was any way back from the brink of oblivion. As the war reached a fever pitch, Zephyr knew that he had to make a choice. He could continue to fight, to pour every last ounce of his strength and ingenuity into the machines that had become his only companions, his only reason for being. Or he could try to find another way, to reach out to the natives and find a path to peace, no matter how slim the chances of success might be. In the end, it was a simple gesture that changed everything. a native child, lost and alone on the battlefield, stumbling into the path of one of Zephyr's machines. The robot, programmed for destruction, raised its weapon to strike. But at the last moment, something strange happened. A flicker of recognition, a spark of empathy, stayed the machine's hand. And in that moment, Zephyr knew what he had to do. He called off his machines, ordering them to stand down and cease their attacks. And then, in a gesture that stunned the natives and his own creations alike, he stepped out onto the battlefield, his hands raised in a sign of peace. It was a tense moment, fraught with the weight of all the blood and destruction that had come before. But slowly, cautiously, the natives began to lower their weapons as well. And in that fragile, fleeting instant of calm, Zephyr began to speak. He told them of his own world, of the people who had cast him out, and the machines that had become his only solace. He spoke of his dreams of a better future, of a world where the power of technology could be harnessed for good, not destruction. And he offered them a choice: to continue to fight, to risk annihilation and the destruction of everything they held dear, or to join him in building something new, something better. It was a moment that would change the course of history, a turning point in the long and bitter war between man and machine. And as the natives began to lay down their arms and step forward to join Zephyr, he knew that he had found his true purpose at last. In the years that followed, Zephyr and the natives worked together to rebuild what had been lost, to forge a new society based on cooperation and mutual understanding. The machines that had once been instruments of war became tools of creation, helping to build homes and cities, to cultivate crops and heal the wounded. And at the center of it all was Zephyr, the visionary who had dared to dream of a different path, who had risked everything to bring about a new era of peace and prosperity. He became a legend among his people, a symbol of the power of compassion and the resilience of the human spirit. But even as he basked in the glow of his success, Zephyr never forgot the lessons he had learned on the battlefield. He knew that the line between creation and destruction was a thin one, and that the machines he had built could just as easily be turned to darker purposes if they fell into the wrong hands. And so he worked tirelessly to ensure that his legacy would endure, that the machines he had created would always serve the greater good. He taught his children and his children's children the values of empathy and understanding, the importance of using technology to lift up rather than to destroy. And as he looked out over the thriving, peaceful world he had helped to create, Zephyr knew that he had found something worth fighting for, something that would endure long after he was gone. For in the end, it was not the machines that had saved him, but the humanity he had found within himself, the spark of compassion and hope that had guided him through the darkest of times and into the light of a brighter future.